In the first part of the Government-NGO Relations lecture, we looked at NGO sources of power, their main functions, and the dilemmas that they face. We started to introduce the case of the People's Republic of China and noting the sort of relationships between the central and local state. We will continue our conversation in this lecture looking at the People's Republic of China and looking at a case study in particular of how NGOs interact with the government. NGOs in China have increased ostensibly since the 1978 market reforms. The latest numbers indicate that there are 440,000 registered organizations across China. This figure can increase up to tenfold once unregistered organizations are factored. NGOs have come to offer a range of services and support for many different and often marginalized groups in Chinese society. In effect, they have the capacity to be alternative social and welfare providers, and have generally proven to be effective at this task when they're provided with the space to operate. In this backdrop, the local state has experienced a strain on its finances, which has consequently reduced its ability to deliver social services to its constituents. The restructuring of state-owned enterprises, a shedding of social welfare responsibilities, and fiscal decentralization have all contributed to an increasing financial burden on cash-strapped local state authorities in terms of social and welfare provision. Now, the study I will introduce in this lecture seeks to answer this meta question. Why do we witness low levels of voluntary collaboration between the local state and NGOs in China? It seems that greater collaboration between the local state and NGOs will be advantageous for both parties. It would simultaneously alleviate the local state's burden to address a number of social welfare concerns. But moreover, it would allow NGOs that potentially have the resources and capacity to tackle such issues to execute their respective mandates. The reality, however, shows that this kind of collaboration between the local state and NGOs in China have been rather minimal. The study will seek to understand local state-NGO interactions through an analysis of the strategies and methods that are utilized to establish collaboration. In addition, we will probe into the interactive role that vigorous isomorphic pressures and epistemic awareness, concepts we've talked about in early lectures, play in determining whether or not NGOs collaborate, or to what extent they collaborate with the local state and vice versa. The study focuses on the Beijing and Shanghai cases. 28 NGOs were interviewed, 15 in Beijing and 13 in Shanghai, representing a good cross-section in both cities of varying material, symbolic, interpretive, and geographical powers amongst NGOs. As we discussed in our last lecture, these are the powers that NGOs generally have. The NGOs interviewed have a budget between $1,600 US and $6.35 million US per annum, with the average NGOs interviewed having a budget of $78,283 per annum. Most NGOs interviewed had secured their financial resources with the aid of a mix of domestic and international funding support. The NGOs in the sample have an arithmetic mean of 8.5 years of operation in China, with a range between 2 to 19 years of existence. As we have seen in our lectures on new institutionalism, new institutional theorists articulate this idea that organizations that occupy a shared sector will eventually begin to copy one another due to coercive, mimetic, and normative pressures. If we remember, the classic formulation of isomorphic pressures is that coercive isomorphism stems from political influence and the problem of legitimacy. Mimetic isomorphism results from standard responses to uncertainty, and normative isomorphism is associated with professionalization. Put differently, coercive pressures can be attributable to state regulations and an NGO's overdependence on donors. Mimemic isomorphism has a tendency to occur in an uncertain environment where organizations will begin to copy successful models as a mechanism for coping with changeable conditions. By copying, NGOs are able to quickly establish legitimacy without having to build a repertoire of practices, which can be time-consuming without necessarily leading to any tangible outcomes. And this is particularly the case of China, where the environment for NGOs can oscillate depending on state behavior. Finally, normative isomorphism emerges when certain attitudes and approaches lead to the professionalization of NGOs. Notwithstanding the increasing quantity and diversity of the NGO sector in Beijing and Shanghai, coercive isomorphic pressures are prevalent due to the existing regulatory environment that manages NGOs. Officially, all NGOs are required to be registered. Many organizations try to avoid this lengthy bureaucratic process by registering for a for-profit commercial or business entity. And so what's really interesting to observe is that the efforts to launch collaborative projects between the local state and NGOs in Beijing and Shanghai are often limited. Although collaboration, as we talked about, offer both parties, the state and the NGO, an opportunity to pool their resources, the local state rarely engages in voluntary collaborative efforts, except when the local state is familiar and knowledgeable of a specific individual NGO project. One main method of sustaining contact and collaboration with local municipal authorities is for NGOs to mobilize their material power and market their services to the city. Now, whether or not this strategy translates to projecting an increased level of mimemic isomorphic pressures is another narrative. The evidence suggests that while NGOs have copied a successful model to market their services, they've done so without the awareness of each other's tactics. Now, granted, the modeled organization may be unaware of their potential mimemic activity in this respect, or the models of success may be diffused unintentionally through employee transfer or turnover, or via trade associations. Notwithstanding, this is not a possibility that can be entertained in the Beijing and Shanghai context. To reiterate, they have no direct awareness of each other's work and have self-reported little to no awareness of other NGOs' activities. They are working in completely different sectors of operation, hence having little chance of unintentional contact that may lead to copying tactics. Furthermore, amongst the NGOs in Beijing and Shanghai that was studied, they rarely experience employee transfers between NGOs. Potentially, uncertainty in the institutional environment and their relationships with the local government have led NGOs to develop an independently derived, pragmatic approach to marketing their material power and the utility of using their services to local authorities. Interestingly, this tactic becomes difficult to execute given that the local government has not achieved sufficient epistemic awareness of NGOs' potential capacity. NGOs have reported difficulties in establishing collaborative opportunities, have portrayed local authorities as lacking trust and knowledge of the sector. For instance, in one NGO, local officials were often invited to their monthly talk. However, the majority of these invitations were declined. The representative of that NGO doubts whether local authorities have any incentive to use their symbolic or interpretive powers, other than to promote GDP growth, as a career promotion in local government often places significant emphasis on economic development. Less than half of NGOs interviewed believe that knowledge levels of the local authorities in Beijing and Shanghai have improved with regards to the NGO sector, whereas more than half of the interviewees suggest that the knowledge levels and trust for NGOs are still very low. The interviews suggest that greater state collaboration and epistemic awareness of NGOs by the local state will be achieved through the professionalization of NGOs. This is a heuristic variable that signals normative isomorphic change. Professionalization in the context of this study essentially refers to having established a respected organizational identity alongside a continuation and expansion of its service provisions to relevant constituents. Seemingly normative pressures to homogenize come from the similar attitudes and approaches through the process of professionalization. In fact, according to one representative interviewed, the local authorities were seen to be more willing to grant collaboration once NGOs have developed professionalized capacity and gained the approval of the wider community. Direct contact and communication with individual officials is another tactic by which some NGOs have fostered epistemic awareness of the NGO's capacity. While there's no promise of collaboration that's guaranteed with this strategy, the NGO can nevertheless establish a direct line to the relevant government departments. What the study has suggested is that the local state lack meaningful knowledge of the NGO sector, just as NGOs have not sufficiently matured to become part of an epistemic community at present. Given that NGOs are relatively new to the social landscape in China, we can suggest that the Chinese NGO sector has not developed sufficiently to become part of a mature epistemic community in which their expertise or interpretive powers can be used as reference points by the state. In time, however, it is plausible that NGOs in China may become part of a mature community of experts, where they can effectively harness not only their material power, but their symbolic, interpretive, and geographical powers. There are, however, reservations in this regard. We can prognosticate that it's not simply a matter of time before Chinese NGOs mature into epistemic communities. Rather, given the strength of the Chinese state and the existence of strong coercive isomorphic pressures, any production of knowledge outside the state arena may challenge the legitimacy of China's party state and thereby become intolerable and ultimately hinder this development of NGOs. In effect, in the existence of structural inertia that is rooted in the party state system and the regulatory framework, it undeniably dominates local state relationships, meaning that NGOs will need to stay one step ahead of the state. To do so, NGOs need to produce new knowledge and, more importantly, anticipate surprises or discover the unknown. While the institutional environment in which NGOs are operating are slowly changing, thereby allowing greater participation of NGOs to address a number of social issues, the majority of the NGOs we interviewed still perceive the state as having limited meaningful knowledge of the sector. Moreover, if even epistemic awareness is achieved, it is quite plausible that the state will develop a strategy of strategic ignorance to vary its degree of acknowledgement of an NGO depending on a pragmatic calculus that is based on the NGO's resources for social and welfare considerations. In other words, what the state might do is it would factor whether or not the NGO can be used to gather its material power. Or put another way, in essence, by factoring whether NGOs can utilize its material power rather than symbolic, interpretive, and geographical power to supplant the local state social and welfare provisions. This concludes our two-part lecture on government-NGO relationships. In our next lecture, we'll turn our attention to the innovative policymaker.